Hey guys, it's Mrs. Severson. So welcome back. This time we're going to be talking about the economy in the 1920s. The next video in my series will be kind of focusing mostly on the culture and the way that things changed for various groups, but right now we're just going to talk about the economy only. So the 1920s we've talked a lot about already. That's kind of a time of America roaring, so that's why it's called the Roaring 20s in terms of economics. The standard of living increased really rapidly at this time. New inventions were being turned out all the time, which allowed people to have more leisure time with their families because they weren't hand washing everything and ironing things, with an old-fashioned iron. Who was really responsible for this idea of new inventions being turned out really quickly and really cheaply, obviously, is Henry Ford. So we've talked about the assembly line before, but the idea of dividing a huge task like building a car into smaller tasks and everyone's kind of standing at their own spot on the belt made it so much easier and so much faster to make things like cars, especially. So just to give you an idea, it used to take, before 1925, over 12 hours. So it took all the men in the factory 12 hours to put this car together. After the Henry Ford developed his assembly line and interchangeable parts, then it was every 10 seconds. So that kind of dropped the price from a car in 1908 from $850 all the way down to $295 in 1924. And in that time, the prices of money, so like inflation didn't rise tons. So the idea that it was a quarter of the price was obviously very attractive. So many more people could buy cars, and then that became a huge thing. People could travel to see their families. So that kind of idea spread, and the use of the assembly line spread to new inventions, as well as higher wages, which Henry Ford again pioneered, and lower prices, so people were able to afford all of these new inventions. There also was the idea of indoor plumbing that became highly centralized and highly available. So people had this new focus on hygiene, as well as inventions and convenience. So all the things that are listed here, like electric razors, curling irons, washing machines, refrigerators, like mouthwash, deodorant, toothpaste, women's cosmetics, all of those things became super popular because people were so focused on their hygiene and wanted to have all of the newest, latest things. So the two industries that changed a ton at this point, that influenced the economy heavily, and then influenced pop culture, which we're going to talk about next time, was the airline and the radio industry. So we know already that 1903 kind of brings about the Wright brothers, the famous story of them making their first flight, and then after that, the airplane industry started to take off. So right around World War I, where these planes were used in warfare for the first time, they developed these things called ailerons, which was in the steering column, and allowed planes to actually steer where they wanted to go, and started to make planes out of like larger, sturdier materials, so they could be used in battle. And then President Wilson, after World War I, decided that he was going to start using planes in the Postal Service to make package delivery a lot faster. So that kind of revolutionized that. And then we have this guy, Charles Lindbergh, 1927, he made the first successful transatlantic flight, which allowed people to kind of think through being able to travel further distances, and open up the idea of commercial airliners that could go from country to country instead of just one point to one point inside of our own country. Speaking of further communication, radio industry, which was not invented until 1913, so this is kind of a new thing, really took off in the 20s. The first broadcast ever that reached regular people's radios that were becoming really popular in the 20s was of President Harding's victory in 1920 in the election. So then these names should be pretty familiar. NBC and CBS became national radio networks. They developed radio networks all over the country and started broadcasting like daily shows. Like I'm sure you guys hear like the daily shows on radio in Madison, or you look forward to like their little segments every day if you're listening to it on the way to and from school. That was kind of a new idea, and these guys brought in new actors and musicians to appear on the shows. So it kind of brought that like great glamour of Hollywood home to people, and they could start to feel like they knew these people or knew what was going on out in the world outside their home for the first time. So definitely revolutionary things happening at this point. And then the idea of using radio ads actually began in the 1928 election. So we still use those all the time. That's the best way to reach the highest number of people. So this whole consumer society idea that advertising led to more sales because they were turning out so many new inventions at this point that people didn't know that they were out there. So advertising became a huge industry in of itself, and people were able to see what was out there. And then that led to the idea of like spending on things that they necessarily couldn't afford right away. So they used installment plans and buying on credit to kind of keep up with the Joneses, and to ward off diseases and keep up their hygiene and things like that. The problem with installment plans is if you can't afford the weekly payments or the monthly payments, however you set it up, then that becomes a problem if you have too many installment plans being, paid out at the same time. And, what happens if you lose your job? We didn't have employment insurance at this point. So we still have the idea of buying on credit, and it's bigger than it has ever been. But it's one of those things where you have to be really careful, to make sure that you still have a job so you can pay these things off. So that kind of became a huge thing, and we'll talk more about how that led to the stock market issues later on throughout this unit. So anyway, the new inventions also started creating this idea of a middle class. So previous to the 1920s, it was mostly the rich people and the poor people, and there were very, very few people in between. But now the new ways of turning out inventions and building things kind of developed this class of middle people, like managers, engineers, service people, that became part of a middle class, and it was growing a ton. The industrial class, too, was growing a lot at this point, more than just the super, super low wage people. So there's this industrial class in between the really poor and the middle class that started becoming popular because owners actually started taking after Henry Ford and deciding to pay their workers a lot more and giving them this idea of welfare capitalism. So the welfare capitalism is based on the principle that employees will stay with your company if you invest in their welfare. So it's not the same as the way we use the welfare system today. So just to clarify, but these companies were allowing workers to buy stock and own stock in the company that they worked for, so they were really invested in it. They were able to share in profits. They got pensions, so that means like a retirement fund, so they could pay into that and collect that when they retired. They could get medical benefits and things like that. So for most people in the 1920s, life was doing pretty well, except for these guys. So the poor farmers during the 1920s are really the only group that did not do well. And I do emphasize the only group that didn't do well. So these farmers during World War I had borrowed tons and tons of money to expand their land, to buy new farm equipment, anything that they could do to keep up with the huge demand for food for soldiers. Well, after the war, that demand wasn't there anymore. And the Europeans couldn't afford to buy American products anymore because they were paying back all their war debt, and they had to figure out how to produce their own food at a cheaper price. So prices of food in America dropped really quickly, and there wasn't that high demand anymore. So you have tons and tons of product with not a lot of demand. So let's think basic economics here. This food is going to be really cheap, and the farmers are not going to make any money on it, right? And they can't pay back any of their loans. They can't pay back any of that farm equipment. So a lot of farmers in the 1920s ended up really bankrupt. So senators in these farming kind of estates tried to pass a law that would subsidize these things for farmers and buy up the extra food and sell it at a loss overseas, so at least they could make some money. But President Coolidge decided to veto that bill because he didn't want to start this wave of bailing people out if they were not doing well. Now, obviously, our society is a little bit different and has kind of a different focus, but this is definitely a new crisis and a new way of dealing with things in the 20s. So just kind of keep that in mind, that while most people were doing super well in the 20s, the farmers were not necessarily joining in that prosperity. Okay? All right. I will see you guys next time for pop culture in the 20s.